and welcome. The comedian Stephen Wright once said in one of his routines, you know what it's like when you're sitting in a chair and you're leaning back on two legs and you go too far and you just barely catch yourself from falling backward? Well, that's how I feel all the time. I think many folks these days are more and more aware of this field of anxiety and fear that we're living in. And when I've turned to investigate fear and anxiety in my life, sometimes it's exactly like that, like I'm just catching myself from falling backward in a chair. And sometimes it's more subtle. And sometimes I notice that my anxiety is kind of like a low-grade fever. It's just there, kind of coloring everywhere I look. And what I'd like to share here is a little bit on how to work with anxiety when you're aware of it. And if you have no anxiety, it might be helpful for someone you know who does. I'd like to talk first about how there's sort of healthy anxiety and unhealthy anxiety. A little bit about the source of anxiety and fear, and then a little bit on how you can shift your relationship with it. And fear and anxiety has a wisdom quality to it. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how do you cultivate what we could almost call healthy fear or healthy anxiety. A good friend of mine once told me how he went to a men's retreat. Kind of a large men's retreat, and someone initiated a conversation which rapidly turned into a massive argument. And the question was, are you a 5-day packer or a 1-day packer? And the two camps formed very, very quickly. The 1-day packers were saying to the 5-day packers, you're so bound up in fear and anxiety. Just let go, live your life. Just take one bag and go have an adventure. The 5-day packers hit back and they said, you're precisely the idiots who come to us asking for a Band-Aid or for toothpaste. Take some responsibility in your life. Pack some extra stuff and be safe. Be ready for what might happen. So what type are you? Are you a 1-day packer where you just jump in and make it up as you go? Or are you a 5-day packer? Are you someone who needs to take everything that you might possibly need before you head out? And I think it's clear that one is not better than the other. I realize I'm kind of in my own category when it comes to this. I'm a 1-bag traveler. I'm a little manic around traveling anywhere in 1 bag in perpetuity. I totally geek out on travel. It's been a long time since I've traveled, since quarantine. But at some point, if you're happy, if you're interested, I would be happy to share with you my traveling with 1 bag forever. It really comes down to 4 words: merino wool and daily laundry. And one of my bids for most idiotic ambition of all time was when I was at the ripe old age of 23. After finishing my term in the Peace Corps in West Africa, I attempted to cross the Sahara Desert on my bike from south to north. My friend Kevin Hickey, who I met half dead on the side of the road in Niger, West Africa, he did it from the north to the south, and as he was recuperating from that ordeal, he told me all about world travel on a bike. He'd been, I think, 5 years he'd been on his bike, and I just became obsessed with it. This is before mountain bikes and things like sealed bearings. I picked up a bike. I got in the best shape of my life, and I didn't really, because it was such a crazy plan, I really didn't have any plans other than just north. But what happened was, as I was getting ready to go, There are these winds called the Harmattan winds that come down off Algeria, and they were particularly nasty at that time. It was like a fog, except it was dust. And also the hot season came early. It was not uncommon for it to hit 120 where I lived. I had spent about a year and a half preparing for this trip and mostly telling everyone I was going to do it. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. I had a sense of dread about this, but my ego overrode my fear, and I took off. And it was a really, really dumb thing to do. I got exhausted and I got really sick, and I didn't make the trip. I tried to recuperate. I made it back to where I started, tried to recuperate, took off again, and it just didn't work. So in that case, that was not the healthiest decision in my life. There were a number of fears going on there. One was the fear of death, but one was the fear of kind of the shame around not doing what I had told everyone ad nauseum that I was going to do. But fear in its highest form is really kind of clear discernment. There was some element of fear for me that was saying, "You moron, don't go. This is really, really dumb. It's a very, very dangerous thing to do." If I was able to listen to that, it would have helped me to make some choices that may have been a little bit healthier. But I chose to kind of go with the unhealthy fear, which is basically all the thoughts that are not based in reality, kind of the hallucination I had around what was going to happen as opposed to the reality of what happened. So whenever you're experiencing anxiety or fear around a decision or something like that, it's always so helpful to slow down and take a look at it. There's always two sides of a coin. When we look at fear, when we turn to actually face fear, we can see it for what it is. And it's always two sides of the coin. I paddle on the Potomac River every day I can. And as it gets hot, a lot of the copperheads and Virginia water snakes, they go up on the rocks to kind of sun themselves. So my fear of snakes make me a little bit jumpy when I'm out there and I come to some rocks. But it also means I probably won't get bitten by a copperhead by trying to pet it and make friends with it. There are different antidotes to fear that I'd like to talk about, but essentially the intention is to get familiar with it. So I'd like to take a look at how fear shows up and how looking at the underbelly of fear and anxiety can be really helpful. A friend of mine was deep in his business. His dream was to have his own business, and he worked for many years for a corporation, kind of saved his money, had this idea for buying a company. He got a board, he got investors, and he worked really, really hard building up his company. It was a software company. And at one point, he was told there was a cash flow that he couldn't make. It couldn't make payroll. He needed more cash infusion to keep going, and he didn't have it. He had tapped everyone out. So he had to lay off 20% of his employees. He had to tell his investors he was doing this. He had to tell the staff that he was doing this. And before he had to tell them, he told me he was sleeping about 2 hours a night, just racked with anxiety. And it was a mixture of fear and shame and terror, a feeling of being out of control and being incompetent. And it absolutely paralyzed him. But then it shifted, something shifted. And as I asked him about this, he said he realized at one point that there was nothing more he could do. Like once he realized there's nothing more I can do here, he just sat with that idea of like, can I just be with this horrible situation as it is? And as he sat with it, this little voice came to him and the voice just said, I just have to ride this out. I just have to be with it and ride it out. And something about that pausing and the recognition that he had done all he could, that he had to write it out, he chose to write it out. And he told his investors, he told the board, he did the cuts he needed to do. And as hard as that was, they got through the cash flow issues. He ended up selling his company and moving on to bigger things. And essentially, his capacity to turn toward that paralyzing experience of the dread of failure, the dread of shame, the dread of loss, by being with it, by staying with it, by kind of looking at it, it kind of came to really these two wings of mindfulness. What's true? Like, what's the reality? What's true? That's the first question. That's wisdom. And he said when he realized that there was nothing that he could do to fix it right now, just recognizing that truth helped him to kind of soften a little bit. The next question we can ask ourselves is, can I be with it? Can I be with this? And as he sort of explored that in his own fashion, he realized there's nothing I can do. All I can do is just ride this wave to wherever it takes me. Wisdom and compassion or loving presence. What's true? Can I be with it? You know, it's easy for me to kind of share that story, but I know, because this is a good friend of mine, the utter dread and despair and obsessing and clenching he went through. And I would imagine you know that feeling, that feeling of dread. You know, it's described by some as the clench. You know, there's just this clench inside, this felt sense in your nervous system that just says something is wrong, something is off. It's like a twisted feeling inside, like something terrible is going to happen. So when we explore fear and anxiety, it's interesting to kind of sense, well, what's the source? Now, this particular model is, I'm not sure it's strictly within the framework of Buddhist psychology, but I find this has been so helpful for me. That one form of how fear and anxiety shows up has to do with survival. And that sense of survival can be when your life is in danger, when you're under a threat where you feel physically terrified. But it also has to do with identity. Just the survival of some identity that you have. You know, maybe it's about being a good person, or maybe for him it was around being the boss and being the entrepreneur. When that's under threat, fear, anxiety. The second it shows up is the fear of losing control. It's the feeling of just chaos, of being absolutely at the mercy of forces larger than you, having no control whatsoever. The third and this is the fear of losing affection, attention, and love. The fear of losing respect, the shame that we experience as part of a culture or a society. So these three sources of fear, of survival, physical survival or identity, the fear of losing control and the fear of losing affection, attention, and love, are powerful, powerful forces. And for my friend, it was a full whammy. His livelihood, the income supporting his large family, and his identity as this up-and-coming young entrepreneur. And the fear of losing control, there was nothing he could do. He might lose the entire thing. And of course, affection, attention, and love, the social status that he had about being an entrepreneur, letting down his investors, letting down his staff, everyone who was kind of cheering him on, letting all of them down. All of that was just crashing down. When we are overcome with fear and anxiety, we quite naturally go into a self-protective state where either we move into fight, flight, or freeze. Either we find ourselves just hypervigilant, or we disassociate, or we just kind of lock up inside. And there are kind of levels of fear. Philip Moffat talks about how there's the normal state of alertness fear. It's like you're driving. And as you're driving along, there's some function of your brain that's thinking, don't die, don't die, don't die. Look out for that truck. Make sure you stop. Look both ways at the stop sign. And then there's prolonged anxiety or fear. And I think of this almost as like that low grade anxiety fear, where you can feel the hypervigilance coming in, where you're sort of sensing that something catastrophic is going to happen. And you're just sort of like, you're scanning for something really, really threatening. And it's really hard to turn that off. And then the third level is trauma. It's when the fear is locked in. And that's when you're chronically caught in fight of hypervigilance, anger, lashing out, or you're chronically locked into this sense of disassociation, or you're chronically locked into freeze, which can be afflicted with doubt, self-criticism, or the fear just makes you unable to move. And no doubt, if you're meditating, you're seeing this more and more, how this shows up, how the times when you're in a natural state of alertness, all the way to the frozen places inside, that all arise from fear. And the trick, again, it's so paradoxical. It's about your capacity to get familiar with those patterns. And the more familiar you get with those patterns, the more familiar you become with how you can respond. You get to see how we move from contraction to expansion all the time. How we move from deflation to inflation all the time. There's a very cool thing here about tigers. I think this is a cool reading. One of the most majestic of all creatures is the tiger. For many years, these big, beautiful creatures have puzzled researchers. It seems that when tigers hunt, they have a remarkable capacity for causing their prey to paralyze with fear, a capacity greater than any other of the big cats. As the tiger charges towards its prey, it lets out a spine-chilling roar. Now, you'd think that this would be enough to cause the prey to turn and run for its life, but instead it often freezes, and then it becomes tiger food. So at the turn of the century, scientists at the Fauna Communication Research Institute in North Carolina discovered why you're likely to freeze to the spot rather than run when the tiger charges. When the tiger roars, it lets out sound waves that are audible, the ones that sound terrifying. And it also lets out a sound at a frequency so low you can't hear it, but you can feel it. And so as the tiger emerges from the undergrowth, the flashing of its colors, the sound of its roar, and the impact of the unheard but felt sound waves combine to provide an all-out assault on your senses. The effect is that you are momentarily paralyzed. So even if there may be time to avoid the tiger, you're tricked into standing still long enough for the tiger to leap on you. And our fears operate in the same way. They paralyze us into inactivity, even when the real threat is not immediately upon us. Part of overcoming the challenges before us is to recognize the ability for our fear of what might happen to stop us from dealing well with the challenge. Isn't that amazing? So when the tiger is roaring, it's roaring at a level you can see it, but you feel it in such a way that you just simply stop in panic, and that millisecond of stopping makes you in the tiger food. So we're constantly scanning for danger. That's the nature of the mind. That's the nature of the negativity bias. And when we are in a relatively, shall we say, normal state, that sense of monitoring is sort of a natural function. But when something arises and then we begin to feel paralyzed by it, that's the point where we need to draw on mindfulness, where we need to draw on preferenceless awareness, non-judging awareness, to look closely at what is this that's happening on the inside. I've told this story before of where in my years of living in spiritual community, I was been really, really excited around diet and consciousness, and I was macrobiotic for many years. And then I went beyond macrobiotics and I became macroneurotic, and then fully psychotic, macropsychotic for a period of time. And I was so convinced that I needed to eat pure food, that eating pure food would elevate my meditation practice. And I started getting more fearful of food. And the more strict I got, the more anxiety I had around what I was eating and what was occurring to me. And I started complaining more and more about the food in our community, of how it wasn't pure enough. And I met with one of the senior people in the community, and because I was lobbying for the kitchen to do things differently. And I'll never forget this. He sat down, and we're going to talk about these issues with the kitchen. And he said, just have one question for you. I said, sure. He said, what do happy people eat? And I sat there for a long time. I said, okay, I got it. I'm letting it go. And because I realized in that moment how bound I was by anxiety. And again, how much of my fear was real, and how much of it was a hallucination, a projection. And of course, that becomes part of our practice. You know, the classic story is a woman walks down the street in her village and at dusk, and she sees a snake in the middle of the street, and she almost steps on it, races back to her house and spends the whole night just feeling the trauma of how close she came from being bitten by a snake. And very timidly, she heads out the next morning down the same street and sees that the snake was a rope, just a piece of rope. How many ropes are there in our lives that we interpret as snakes? So the question becomes looking at the reaction to what arises. And it's essentially, it comes down to, do we perceive something as a threat, or do we perceive something as an opportunity? When we're locked into threat, we have a tendency to look for simple strategies that are going to fix it. We kind of repel any kind of like self-questioning or learning, because we're just completely in reaction mode. It's either run away, kill it, or get really, really quiet and hope that the threat passes away. So it's basically a shutdown. When your brain can access opportunity mode, you're moving from short-term preservation to a little more long-term. You're moving from kind of the clench of reactivity to a little more spacious. And it gives you access to what some call the discovery process. And a great analogy for the discovery process is when you go to a restaurant and you look around and you see what other people are ordering, and then you might adjust what you're going to order. So you can kind of sense the kind of the alternating currents of threat and opportunity in your life. When we're under threat, it's the hyperactive amygdala. You're caught in a loop of chronic stimulation and fear. It's the limbic hijack. You're just taken over by the reptilian brain that's looking for self-preservation. And I know that loop really, really well, and maybe you do too. But as soon as we can become more aware of how we're caught, things can begin to shift. So shifting your relationship with anxiety and fear is a really, really interesting inquiry, I find. The number one fear, according to someone on the internet, is public speaking. The number one fear of public speaking, greater than the fear of death. I think it was Jerry Seinfeld who said that they would rather be the person in the coffin than the person giving the eulogy. Other fears: spiders, snakes, heights, crowded places, dogs, thunder and lightning, small spaces, germs, flying. There's trypophobia, the fear of holes. So how do you work with all these fears? So the Dalai Lama was asked about this. And he said, I'll share a little bit of what he said. He said the first thing is to think about actions and their effects. Usually when something happens, we say, oh, very unlucky. And when something good happens, we say, oh, very lucky. Actually, the Dalai Lama said these two words, lucky and unlucky, are insufficient. There must be some reason. And because of a reason, a certain time became lucky or unlucky, but usually we don't go beyond lucky or unlucky. And the reason is karma or past actions. So he says one way to work with deep fears is to think that the fear comes as a result of your own actions in the past. If you have a fear of some pain or suffering, you should examine whether there is anything you can do about it. If you can, there's no need to worry about it. If you cannot do anything, then there's also no need to worry. Another technique is to investigate who is it that's afraid. Examine the nature of the self. Well, where is this I? What is the nature of I? Is there an I besides my physical body and my consciousness? That might help. And someone who's engaging in compassion practices, you might ask yourself, are there others who have fear similar to mine? So there's a lot here to unpack. To really, when you're feeling fear or anxiety, to ask yourself, is there something from the past that's creating this? Is to ask yourself, is there anything I can do to kind of alleviate this fear and anxiety? Or is this beyond my control? And that is a really powerful practice, which I'll like to talk about a little bit later. The other is to ask yourself, well, who is it that's afraid? Can I find that one who is afraid? What is the nature of the one who's afraid? That's a little esoteric, but it can be also powerful. And then there's the heart practice of really just, wow, other people feel this too. To recognize that you're not the only person on the planet feeling this fear and anxiety, but actually it's something that's shared. I find that practice to be pretty juicy, because then I realize it's not about my fear. It's about the fear. It's not like the fear necessarily goes away, but it's it's almost like there's something larger that's feeling that fear. Quite often, there's this very, very interesting practice I've learned, and I kind of consider myself somewhat of an expert on fear, just because I've been a really fearful. I've had a lot of fear in my life, a lot of that low-grade anxiety. And I'd say for me, one of the most powerful things is to really ask myself, is there anything I can do about this? Is there any action I can take that might alleviate this fear? And to be more specific, I always like to reference a beautiful TED Talk. It's called Fear Planning by Tim Ferriss. It's a TED Talk where, in essence, when you are aware of a fear or an anxiety, now this is a very cognitive process, that when you're aware of a fear, you can ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen? Now, this has been an amazing practice for me, because quite often, if I don't identify my thoughts, they just keep shifting and moving through. So I really recommend to do it journaling, and I do this a lot. So if I'm like giving a workshop and I realize, wow, I'm anxious about this, I write down, what's the worst that could happen here? And something about just writing it down can be really, really helpful. They'll hate me. I'm going to run out of things to say. I'm going to be unskillful as to how I respond to someone with a question or a sharing. Write it all down. And once you've written all that down, then you ask yourself 2 more questions. What can I do to avoid this experience? And then you just brainstorm. Well, I could really make sure my lesson plan is solid. I can make sure I sleep well beforehand. I can make sure I really deeply pause before I respond to someone when they ask a question. And that has a calming effect when I realize, wow, there are actually things I can do. There are behaviors and actions I can take that might alleviate that. And the next question, again, is equally important. What can I do to correct it if it happens? And now, again, when I realize, wow, you know what? I can just say, I don't know the answer to that question. Or I can apologize for being unskillful. When I realize, wow, so here are the things that could happen. Here are the things I can do to kind of alleviate that. And here are the things I can do to correct it if it happens. For me, again, from a cognitive point of view, oh my gosh, so calming. Highly, highly recommend that exercise and do check out the TED Talk, because it's beautifully, beautifully set up. He talks about it from the perspective of the Stoics, which is very, very akin to these teachings as well. A great quote from Pema Chodron. Usually we think that brave people have no fear. The truth is that they are intimate with fear. When I was first married, my husband said I was one of the bravest people he knew. When I asked him why, he said, because I was a complete coward, but I went ahead and did things anyhow. I love that. I know for myself, being a relatively anxious individual, that it's been, however I've been able to move forward, has been so helpful. Kind of back to like one bag travel. Whenever I have headed out on a long trip somewhere, inevitably, just before I go, I'm thinking to myself, why am I doing this trip? I don't need to go. I'm totally fine where I am. Why did I even say yes to this? And then I go, and then I have this amazing adventure that I'm so grateful for. I think part of the recognition of fear, again, is that there's an element of fear that has to do with wise discernment. There's an element of consciousness saying, if you're going to do this, look out for this and this and this, because That might either kill you or might be a real obstacle. So there's a wisdom faculty to it. And then, of course, there's the hallucination faculty to it as well. But I have also found that many professional musicians, before they begin to perform, they go through a lot of anxiety and a lot of jitters. But what they found after doing it 1,000 times is that once they start, 5-10 seconds into it, they just kind of kick into their flow. So listening to the voice of anxiety and discerning, what does this voice have to teach me? What's the lesson in here for me? And can you discern what's the hallucination in here for me? So there's so much to talk about here, and there's so little time left. I think I may do a part 2 here. Another element of working with fear beyond just the cognitive is to really explore it somatically, to sense where it lives on the inside. And again, quite often as you turn to investigate fear and anxiety, you can discover that clench. And sometimes it's related to some form of trauma, that is to say, some fear, but also maybe a sense of hopelessness. And it's not necessarily wise to barrel right in to explore the sensations associated around fear. What can be helpful is to kind of ease your way into it, to kind of sense how you can make yourself kind of feel safe in the body. I have just a few minutes to share about this, but I'd like to just say a little bit around what I have found helpful. And again, the analogy which I use a lot is that the mind fixates on what's not working. And one of the best, most simple analogies I can bring up is I'm heading to the dentist shortly. Been out of the dentist's office for this whole quarantine period, and I'm dreading going in. And I know my strategy when my teeth are being worked on, and this works brilliantly for me, is I keep telling myself that my hands feel great. The nature of my mind is to focus on what the heck they're doing in my mouth and to focus on the dreaded sound of the drill and to anticipate the flinches of pain that may come. But if I can remember to keep my awareness in my hands, where my hands feel okay, that becomes my home base. And sometimes, not all the time, I can come through a dentist appointment feeling pretty relaxed because I'm focusing more there. So when you start to really turn your attention toward the investigation of anxiety and fear, it can be very helpful to sense, well, where don't I feel it? Where don't I feel it? And can I just rest there? And what you may find is that there's a way that you can kind of be with it. Just as I find when I'm at the dentist, I can be it. I can bear this experience. And then sometimes I can begin to make little adventures away from the palms of my hands to kind of explore the sensations as they're happening, to investigate a little bit of what's going on. And I find that to be so, so helpful. So I think what we'll do just with these remaining minutes that we have is a little investigation into fear and anxiety. And we're not going to take a deep dive here, but just a little bit of a reflection. If you like, you might close your eyes. And you might take just a few slow and full deep breaths. And you might just, as you feel the breath, just sense the quality of the present moment. Notice the quality of feeling. And you might just acknowledge in your own way this sort of the normal, natural state of alertness. This is the quality where you're walking or you're driving and everything's fine, but your mind is sort of scanning for danger so that you can stay safe. Just sense that function of consciousness. And you might sense the experience where the fear or anxiety is a little bit more prolonged, where there's a little more hypervigilance. And just sense what that's like when the mind is more actively scanning, kind of anticipating some catastrophe. And you might acknowledge the times in your life when you have felt this way. And this third category is when the fear or anxiety is locked in. When you might find yourself caught in kind of chronic fight or flight or freeze. And you might, just as you feel the breath, just acknowledge any moments in your life when you've experienced that. And can you sense or imagine the difference between being afraid and being with your fear? Of what it is to be anxious versus to be with your anxiety. And here there's this quality of the observer, the quality of the witness, this quality of mindfulness. And you might bring into mind something that creates some anxiety for you. And again, perhaps not to make it a big one, but just some form of tension or anxiety or anticipation. And you might just sense the roots here. The one root of fear and anxiety has to do with survival, where you are either under physical threat or your identity is under threat. Sensing the second root, which may have to do with control, the fear of losing control. And this third root of fear and anxiety is the fear of losing affection, attention, and love. And you might sense this profound distinction in practice. That when you feel fear or anxiety arise, the capacity to get familiar with it, to learn more about it, the possibility of moving from the threat mode, into the opportunity mode. As you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And if you'd like, you can open your eyes. So this is part one, exploring anxiety and fear. And next time we'll go a little more into the mechanics of how to work when you really feel fear in your nervous system. I find that the cognitive approach is so helpful. What could happen? What can I do to prevent it? What can I do to alleviate it? I find that to be incredibly calming. But then to explore as well, how do you work it when it's really living on the inside? I'll share with you we'll close with one short story. This is a story of one summer night during a severe thunderstorm. A mother was tucking her small son into bed. She was about to turn the light off when he asked in a trembling voice, Mommy, will you stay with me all night? And the mother gave him a warm, reassuring hug and said tenderly, I can't, dear. I have to sleep in Daddy's room. There was a long silence. At last was broken by these words. That big sissy. May you and your anxiety have a wonderful dance together. May it open into wisdom and compassion. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I look forward to being with you soon.